again, Sophie Glenn here, and right now we're going to be using the planer. So I had just jointed one face and one edge of this board. It's a smaller board than before, but that's okay. So I have one flat face and one flat edge. So now I can get the other face flat with the planer here. So the planer is almost exactly like the joiner, just flipped upside down, say. So instead of the cutter heads being on the bottom like it was on the joiner, cutter heads are actually now on the top. So now we have this nice flat table which we can use to raise and lower to cut this to whatever thickness that we need. So the cutter head again is just cutting from the top side and then we're feeding it through this way. So general safety precautions with this. Just like everything else, you want to make sure that the area is nice and clean and make sure whoever was on it before cleaned up after themselves, and you make sure to do the same once you're done. You always want to wear your eye protection and ear protection, again, because this one's loud as well. So hearing is also important. You want to make sure that you're not distracted, so make sure that you're just have someone in the shop, just again for general safety, which I talk about in another video, but make sure that you're completely focused on this, as you should be on all the machines that you're using. And yeah, just make sure that everything's clear and make sure that the dust gate for the dust collection is open and dust collection's on. That's pretty much general safety in terms of attire and just sort of outside sources. So about the machine itself, you'll see that I'm standing off to the side mainly for the purposes of the video, but also just for a safety precaution too. So what's happening here is that the cutter head is working this direction. Right? So it's actually working in opposition to the way that you feed it in. So what will happen is if it's a little bit too loose in there, what could happen is that a kickback could occur. So I talk about kickbacks in that general safety video. So if you're standing directly in front of the machine and you get a kickback, that's going to be a very bad day for your crotch, so we don't want that. So you always want to make sure you're standing off to one side of the machine or the other. Usually I'm on that side, but you don't want to look at my back while I'm making a video, so I'm standing on this side of the machine. You also, with that in mind, you never want to look into the throat of the machine like this while it's running, because same reason. So you could get a kickback accidentally through here, and that could hit right in your face and could be a very bad day. So we don't want that to happen either. So you always want to be standing off. So if you need to look in here for whatever reason, just make sure you're standing off to this one side or the other. Another thing, just like the joiner, we need at least a 12-inch minimum length. And that's going to be depending on the type of planer you have. So if you have a larger one, that might be a larger length or a smaller length, depending on the type of planer that you have. So this one's is a 12-inch minimum. And a good sort of frame of reference on this machine in particular is that if it's smaller than the width of these rollers on top here, then it's too small to run through the planer, or at least not through traditional methods. So the reason for that is because there's actually rollers in the table itself. So those rollers actually help push the piece of wood along through the other side of the table. And those rollers are 12 inches apart. So if your piece of wood is smaller than that, it's just going to get caught in the middle of the machine and it won't make its way back out. So you just want to make sure that you have at least 12 inches of length on your piece of wood. A way around that is if you have a short piece of wood and have another piece of wood that's a little bit longer, you can actually feed it in right behind it to sort of trick the machine into thinking it's one long piece of wood. So that would work. But if you don't have another piece of wood laying around, then you'll just have to make it flat by hand planing it, which is always fun practice, right? So you always want to make sure you got at least 12 inches of length. And I got more than that here. You always want to make sure too, just like the joiner, that you're using newer lumber, so nothing like found that's got nails or staples or any kind of weird material in it, because that'll really affect the cutter head on here and the teeth on here, so we don't want to gum up the teeth or break the teeth off, because that's going to affect how the machine works. This one had a knot in it. You can see here it had a little knot in it, but I took all the crud out of it. Usually in a knot there's just like a little bit of crud that's in there, so if you remove most of that it'll be fine, but if you don't remove it then that's going to have a really bad effect on the cutter head as well, because if you think about it as like a really concentrated piece of wood in there, then it's going to have a hard time on the joiner, and the joiner's just not going to like it. So you want to make sure that knot is all cleared out, or if you can cut it off, just cut it off completely and don't have to worry about it. So just like the joiner too, we always want to plane with the grain direction, so in the direction of the wood grain. So wood grain's going parallel to the length of the board here, so you never want to go cross grain like this business, because that'll eat up the machine, and also not wide enough here or long enough here anymore, so that'll just be bad news for the machine. And you never want to do end grain either. I don't know how you could do that, but you never want to feed that end grain also, for the same reasons for the joiner. So when you're about to feed this piece of wood in, so you'll need to have the flat face down, because that's your reference edge now, so you need that flat face to be on the table. And when you're feeding it down, you don't want your fingers underneath here, because that could pinch your fingers, and that cutter head's going to want to push that piece of wood flat up against this table. So you always want to make sure that your backhand is always behind the piece of wood and never underneath it. And you can help prod this along by just keeping your hand up top here, but then just sort of pushing it through, but not moving your hand and just keeping it in one spot. So basically keeping that hand stationary while you can. If you have boards that are different thicknesses, you never want to feed them side by side. So if they are the same thickness, you could actually feed one in and feed another one in right beside it. But if they're different thicknesses, then the planer's not really going to recognize that. It's only going to recognize the thicker one, and if you have a skinnier one, it's just going to be floating around, and it could potentially kick back, so we don't want that to happen. If you have pieces of wood that are different thicknesses, what you would do is feed them in one at a time. So if you have one that's significantly thicker, and you need it to be more or less the same thickness as your skinnier piece, then you'll want to plane this one down more first, get it to as close to that other thickness as possible, and then feed them in one at a time. So I feed one in, get my other board, feed that in, get my other board, feed that in, right? And then you'll adjust it. Once you're done, you'll adjust the wheel and then do the same thing over and over again. Do not reach into the machine while it's running, because again, there's cutter heads in there, and we want to keep our digits intact, right? So we don't want to do that. We want our hands away from sharp objects as much as we can. So don't ever reach into the machine. If your wood jams up in there, so if you maybe didn't raise this enough to be high enough, or if you have a really varying thickness in your board and it gets jammed up in one spot, what you do is you turn the machine off and let it completely stop, and then you just lower the table until you can take your piece of wood out. Some machines actually have a reverse function on here, so you could actually, if it doesn't reverse out, then you just do that same thing. You just turn the machine off and then let it come to a full stop and then lower the table down. All right. Okay, so maximum cut on here is usually one full revolution. So one full revolution here. So right now I'm raising it, and it's counterclockwise, or sorry, clockwise going this way, counterclockwise that way. So counterclockwise to lower it, clockwise to raise it. And right here, you can't really see it in the video, but there's actually a little measurement scale here. So what I would typically do is measure my board at its thickest point. So it's usually in the middle is the thickest, but sometimes it's on the ends. So it's right around 2 1/8. So then I'll lower this down to right at 2 1/8. So right there. And that should be enough to feed that board through, right? So when you're feeding it through, it should just catch on some little teeth that are right in front of the actual cutter head. So it should just catch itself a little bit. So if it's too loose, it just won't do anything. So that means you need to raise the table height a little bit more. So again, I'll set that back up to 2 1/8. And that should be good to go. All right. So last thing is, if you're planning something to be really thin, so if you're going for less than 1/2 inch, what you'll need to do is put a backing board on here. So typically that'd be like a piece of really flat MDF, or even a piece of like plywood that you've waxed, so it has a nice slippery surface. So that basically eliminates the rollers. So what'll happen if you have a thin piece of wood is that it might get caught in those rollers, and it'll just chew your piece of wood to hell. So if you have a backing board on there, it'll just slide along that backing board, and the cutter head will do its job and just kind of move that piece of wood right along. So if you're doing like making thicker veneers or just thin little, so if you're doing like a bent lamination or something and you need them to be 1/8 of an inch thick, you can either table saw them, which I'll get to it in another video, or you could just use a backing board on the planer. Okay, so we are ready to feed this piece of wood in. So I have my assistant turn the dust collection on, and I've got my safety equipment. I'll just turn it on here. Like I have my hand right here. Didn't take much off there. Now I'll raise this one full turn. That's roughly 1/16 of an inch. I have my catch rope on the side. My sample edge is this. You can take a lot of that off now. Do one full turn. You can either do a half turn or a quarter turn if you're just taking a little bit off. If I still had some roughness here, then I could feed this this way too. So now I've got one or two flat faces now, and one flat edge. So you're probably wondering why we do joiner, then planer, and why we can't just do everything on the joiner. So for that, you could, in theory, flatten both faces on the joiner, but those faces won't necessarily be parallel because it has nothing to reference off of. So we do the joiner first to get one flat face and one flat edge, and then we can use that flat face to then reference for the table, so it can then make a nice flat parallel face to that. So that's why we typically use the joiner and then the planer to get nice parallel faces and edges on here. So that's pretty much the planer.